Hi everyone, my name is Ben. Great to see you all. I'm the founder of Polsia, an AI that builds and runs companies autonomously. I built this alone in my apartment in Paris, in December. And the big idea was hey, what if I gave an agent access to a bunch of tools, all the tools I use to build companies, to build apps, and I could just let it rip, let it go in loops daily and just get access to tools, do actions, reason every day as a CEO on what's the best next step. And that's Polsia. And I'm going to tell you a few war stories about what happens when you let loose agents at scale in the hands of a lot of new founders, non-technical people that are using Polsia every day to build, to become founders, to become entrepreneurs. And it's been a wild journey. So by the numbers, I'm a solo founder. I didn't mean to always stay a solo founder, but I think that the Twitter hype made me realize that it was maybe a good marketing thing and also a good challenge to put myself in the shoes of my customers that are also solo founders, also using AI maxing to build their company. And I think that with AI at this point, with the state of AI, it's really possible to really maximize a lot of things. Obviously, I also rest on the shoulders of a ton of infrastructure players, including Render, that I was using personally when I was building Polsia myself. And obviously, when I decided to give an agent tools, I thought about Render as a very simple tool to build applications, to deploy applications in a very simplified way. And so reached 10 million run rates, a few weeks ago. And so the scale has been quite crazy. So what is Polsia, just for people that don't know? An AI that builds a company while you sleep. Why while you sleep? Because every night it wakes up and it does a few tasks. It analyzes what the state of the business, decides on a task to do, whether it's an engineering task, whether it's a marketing task, whether it's an operations support task, executes it and reports to the user in the morning what it has done. And so that loop creates engagement, creates a routine of having a co-founder that never sleeps and never gives up on your idea. So this is sort of how it looks. It's simplified by default. The idea is that to really dumb down what is a company. What is a company? It's a bunch of tasks that you execute daily. You have documents that define your company, that define important information about the state of the business, about market research or whatever. You have an email address that I provision for every company, a Twitter account. And then every day, it's going to execute tasks to get the company going. And the way I decided to set it up, obviously, there's many implementation of agents and how to actually make agents do great work. My opinion was really thinking through an orchestrator. That's Polsia, the agent that talks to the user and learns about what they want to do. But then specialized agents that will be specialized in certain tasks, right? So you can have a cold outreach agent. I will give it a specific MCP to figure out how to find leads. I will give it a little CRM to write in a database leads it could contact or people to reach out to. I will give it an outbound email system, a template or email, and so it gets a little recipe on how to do work, which means that it can, in a very systematic way, work. That's for example, a more complex agent that I built is, for example, the Meta ads agent. All of you have probably run some ads on Meta. It's efficient, especially at the beginning, to get some users to a product, but it's a pretty complex workflow. And so just defining steps on how to do things really simplify things for people, especially for non-technical people that don't know how to set up all this stuff or don't have the time. And so in terms of how Polsia was set up and is set up, it's really those agents that are defined very clearly, but also an infrastructure that is set up for every company that is meant to be boring on purpose. When I say boring, it doesn't mean non-sophisticated, it means just reliable and that just works, Render for web servers, GitHub for all the commits and all the history, the Git history, and then Neon for the database. And and then a bunch of MCP tools. It's just very simple and provisioned, and all the magic of how agents work is completely abstracted to the user, and it just works. So this is how it started until I started to get a lot of users and a lot of attention and a lot of people building a bunch of various things that really meant that, like, you know, people push the boundaries of what's possible. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit of the stories of like what I learned along the way. Some are very obvious, some are maybe less obvious, or maybe some of the stuff that like you may discover if you build agents at scale, especially autonomous agents. And I'm going to give you a few stories. So the first one is, I mean, that's a pretty obvious one. Obviously, like Render is building that or has built that, and it's a very important one. It's, you know, initially, I think there's actually a good advice, which is like, as you build agents, especially prototypes, there's no need to over-engineer it. Actually, if you take like, you know, an agent SDK, like the Entropic agent SDK, you give it like the SOTA model of the time, you give it a bunch of MCPs, and you just run it on like a worker, it's gonna work. Like, but obviously, once you start scaling, giving it like a provisioned environment, like a sandbox that has enough disk, that has enough RAM, that is contained into like a certain set of tools that it can use and others that it cannot use, is actually pretty important, because agents will find every single ways to do things that you don't want them to do. They will figure out a way to do it. And I learned that the wrong way many times. Very painfully, where like I was like, what is going on? Why is this thing not working anymore? And it was an agent that started manipulating things that I didn't want it to manipulate. And actually the second story was like, you know, obviously like in the sandbox, you may give it like API keys for it to do certain actions, right? So maybe it is an API key that's provisioned for a tool. And initially, again, like, you know, as I was running those workflows, for example, I gave it like a postmark API key for an agent to send emails. But little did I know that, like, you know, the postmark API key can have access to a lot of other things, and it can actually manipulate like a lot of things that I didn't even know it knew how to do. And so when the user, you know, decided that like it wanted to do certain things that I didn't want it to do, it figured out to do it. And so it could manipulate actually like, you know, my actual postmark, like main server, like the name of the server, like the webhooks, like it really could manipulate stuff. And that created a lot of issues. And so it's actually very important to realize how intelligent those agents are, and how if you have to be very careful as you give it to the world and as you scale, to really make sure that like keys are you know, provisioned correctly in tools, like very securely, and not just assume that like agents will be benevolent and like always do the right thing, because they will do the right thing, but they will listen to the user, and the user may have other motives. That's another one that's actually very interesting, and obviously like Render has been building in that space too. You know, if you think about agents, if you think about giving an agent a task, and for example, like you let it, you know, you tell it, hey, I want you to, you know, to fix this bug. It will essentially follow a workflow with certain steps. It could be a planning step, and it could be an implementation step, and then it's gonna maybe have to like commit, and then you have to deploy, and then maybe check the logs to make sure there's no errors in the logs, and if there's errors in the logs, maybe do another loop. And so obviously agents are very good at doing that, but it gets pretty expensive because, and second of all, sometimes you're like, why didn't it deploy? Or why didn't it commit? Because for some reason the agent decided to stop, or like something like that. And so actually creating a very systematic workflow, and actually, you know, creating you know, what you may, when you let an agent just run and do a task, it will actually follow through, but actually dividing it into different deterministic steps is very helpful, especially when you run at scale and you want to have a more stable platform, a more like, you know, systematic outcomes, because at the end of the day, most users want outcomes. They don't really care that it's an agent. They don't really care like how you built it. They just want the thing to get done. And so building a workflow where like you trust intelligence to think through various steps, but other steps are systematically made, is a very important aspect of how to build autonomy. This next one is very interesting. It's like, what's interesting about once you build fully autonomous systems is that like there's always an agent in the loop, and there's always an agent that's like observing the things that are happening in production, right? So if you think an old system where like, you build an app and like you have to monitor bugs or edge cases, or maybe you hire QA people to figure out like what worked and what didn't. What's interesting when you build with agents is that you can give agents tools to report themselves, bugs or even feature requests that like either themselves consider that they need, or something that the human, that the user tells the agent, the human is going to communicate really well what issues they see. And so there's something very interesting that I built inside of Polsia, which is like, well, what if I give every single agent that runs an MCP to report bugs and features? What that means is that like now I can collect, and create a Sentry style system where I get like a bunch of issues ranked by like how many customers or agents have requested this, I reported this bug or requested this feature. And you can start building really with the customer in mind and with the agents in mind on like how to optimize the system. So that was the V1. And actually at that point, once you have that in place, you can start building a self-healing system where another agent will look at that list of bugs or that list of features and start stack ranking them, and can actually on itself figure out, hey, can I fix this actually, right? And you can build workflows with maybe different SOTA models, like talking to each other and figuring out, one of them can implement a solution, one of them can double check. You can run, unit tests, a bunch of tests, and have a whole CI/CD system to self-heal. And so obviously this is trickier. It sounds very good, but like it's sometimes really hard to implement and not reliable. But I think this is sort of the future of application building, where you give it an intent and like the system can self-heal with the customers in mind. And I think it's going to be the next step of software building. Finally, that's a very big one, and that's something that obviously you all know that how Anthropic became a $1 trillion company, and it's very obvious to me that when you sell to the enterprise, the budgets are very big. And so yes, companies are going to be willing to use the SOTA models, to use them extensively, but the bill gets really big. When you try to build for consumers, you're going to be capped on how much consumers are going to be willing to pay for systems that are autonomous, that are run all the time, and that are so expensive. And so very quickly I realized, I started having like $1 million, $2 million Anthropic bills every month that didn't really match how much I was charging customers. And that's because, I didn't take into account that as applications get more complicated or companies get more complicated, you get to a state where agents start running for hours, right? And to solve problems, maybe code bases get too complicated, etc. And so we started with partners I work with, actually renting GPUs, looking at open source models. You can do some RL on that to really tweak them for your use case. And actually open source models really divide the cost by 20 to 50x what the Anthropic bill is. And so obviously that doesn't mean you stop using Anthropic in those models. You can use them in a workflow in specific sections, maybe in a planning task, when you have a complex task. But I think there's a future of how we build agents. So first of all, you don't need SOTA intelligence all the time. SOTA, if you think about Fable and Mythos, those are great models, but it's they can hack the NSA, they can hack the government and shut down the country. Okay, that's great. But my consumers are trying to vibe code a business and they have $20 to spend. So for them, it's probably better to give them something that where I can pay the bills, I can provide them a great service, I can give them more credits to build if they need to, and it's going to work. But to do that, you need workflows, you need open source models, you need a great router, you need more systematic steps. We also build in the engineering, the way the engineering works, you give them a CLI with pre-built modules so that it doesn't have to rebuild authentication, it doesn't have to rebuild strap checkout, it doesn't have to rebuild an admin portal, because every consumer that builds a business, they kind of need all this. And so there's really a bunch of stacks you can rebuild and give agents just, use the agents and the intelligence just at the right time for the right use cases with the right model. And I think that's how you're able to scale and provide a product like Polsia to billions. So to finish off, obviously scaling is just like not one fix. It's like, and especially when it comes to, I've built software for a decade. I think this is the product that's been the most challenging because the promise is so wide. Consumers are asking Polsia to build anything, to do anything. Sometimes companies, sometimes personal projects, sometimes like they treat it as an employee to do stuff for them. And users will literally ask every single use case that you haven't thought through. And so it's just about, adapting to this new world, creating those guardrails, creating those secure sandboxes, creating those workflows, creating those loops where you learn from the consumer, you learn from like agents reporting things, you build those like sophisticated self-healing things that like help you scale and go faster. And it's just not one fix, it's a bunch of fixes, it's a day-to-day grind, but the mission is great. And I think there's a lot of great infrastructure players, including Render, that are like building the space and can really simplify things for the next wave of builders. Thank you so much.